February 3rd, 2022. A DNA lab in Pennsylvania opens an email that's been 58 years in the making. The match probability? 1 in 480 septillion. To put that in perspective, there have only been 117 billion people who've ever walked this earth. You'd need to search for million planet Earths to find another match. But here's the twist that'll send chills down your spine. The killer had been dead for 42 years. When he murdered 9-year-old Marice Ann Chiverella on a bitter cold morning in March 1964, he lived just 6 blocks from her home, close enough to see her grave from his bedroom window. His name? Never appeared once in nearly 6 decades of investigation files. So how did a college kid with a laptop finally unmask a predator who thought he'd taken his darkest secret to the grave? This is the story of the 4th oldest cold case in American history ever solved. A case that changed how we catch killers and proved something both terrifying and hopeful. DNA never forgets, even when everyone else does. If you're a true crime fan who believes justice should never have an expiration date, hit that subscribe button right now. This case took 58 years to crack, and you're going to want to follow every twist, every breakthrough, and every heartbreak along the way. Ring that notification bell, and let's dive into a story where persistence, science, and one determined teenager changed everything. March 18th, 1964. Hazelton, Pennsylvania. The kind of Wednesday morning where the cold doesn't just touch your skin, it cuts right through your coat and settles into your bones, making you question every decision that brought you outside. Most people would have hit the snooze button one more time, pulled the covers a little tighter, stayed in that warm cocoon for just 5 more minutes. But not Marice Ann Chiverella. She woke up excited that morning, her mind already racing ahead to everything the day held. Tomorrow was the feast day of St. Joseph, a big celebration at her Catholic school, and she'd spent the evening before carefully selecting the perfect canned goods from her father's grocery store. Pears and beets, not the most glamorous gifts, perhaps, but chosen with the kind of thoughtfulness that defined this little girl. She wanted to bring them to her teacher, Sister Josephine, today. She also wanted to get to school early enough to attend morning mass at St. Joseph's Church. For a 9-year-old, that kind of devotion was remarkable. But then again, Marice wasn't your typical 9-year-old. At just 55 pounds with bright blue eyes and dark hair that framed her sweet face, Marice was what everyone in the neighborhood called a good kid, the kind of child who cared more about making others happy than herself. Her family would later describe her as sweet and shy, the type who'd rather listen than speak, who'd rather give than receive. She had dreams, big ones for such a small person. She wanted to become a nun. She'd just gotten an organ from Sears, one of those big catalog purchases that felt like Christmas even when it wasn't. And she was teaching herself to play, her little fingers practicing scales and simple hymns in the evenings after homework. She'd been born on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1954, in Waterloo, New York, which her mother always said was fitting because Marice herself was a blessing to be thankful for. By 1964, the Chiverella family had settled into their life in Hazelton, a Pennsylvania coal mining town where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors looked out for each other's kids, and where doors were left unlocked because, well, who would ever think to lock them? The Chiverella family lived at 533 Alter Street in a neighborhood that felt more like an extended family than just a collection of houses. Her father, Carmen Chiverella, owned the Little Market, a neighborhood grocery store right next to their home. One of those corner stores where you could run in for a loaf of bread and end up chatting for 20 minutes about last Sunday's church service or how the local high school football team was doing. Carmen was the kind of man who knew his customers by name, who'd let people run a tab if times were tight, who was as much a part of the community fabric as the churches and schools. Her mother, Mary, worked at a knitting mill downtown, one of the few employers left as the coal industry slowly died around them. Marice had 4 siblings who made up the lively, loving chaos of the Chiverella household. There was Ronald, 16 years old, the oldest brother who carried that particular mix of responsibility and teenage independence that comes with being the eldest. Carmen Marie, 13, was Marice's only sister, the one she looked up to and confided in. Barry, at 11, was all boy, energy and mischief and protective big brother instincts. And David, just 7 years old, was the baby of the family, though he probably hated being called that. Together, they were a typical mid-century American family, working class, Catholic, tight-knit, living in a town built by immigrants who'd come seeking opportunity in the coal mines. That Wednesday morning started like any other, with the usual rush of getting 5 kids ready for school, the sounds of breakfast being made, the smell of coffee brewing, siblings bickering over the bathroom, Mary making sure everyone had their schoolwork packed. But then Marice asked something unusual, something that would later echo through the decades like a stone dropped in still water. She asked if she could walk to school alone. Now, this wasn't typical. Marice usually walked with her siblings, safety and numbers and all that. Plus, it was just how things were done. St. Joseph's Parochial School was less than half a mile away, 6 blocks, a straight shot through the neighborhood, but she'd never made the trip by herself. This morning was different, though. She had her reasons, and they made perfect sense to a 9-year-old girl with a mission. She wanted to get there early. She wanted to drop off those carefully chosen canned goods before the other students arrived. She wanted to make it to morning mass, to start her day with prayer the way she believed she should. When you're 9 years old and you dream of becoming a nun, these things matter. They matter a lot. Her parents, Carmen and Mary, exchanged one of those looks that parents do, the silent communication that happens in a split second, weighing risks and reasons, independence and safety. This was 1964, remember. This was small-town Pennsylvania, where violent crime was something you read about happening in big cities, not something that touched your neighborhood. This was a place where Mrs. Henderson 3 houses down would wave to you from her porch, where Mr. Kowalski would nod hello as he swept his sidewalk, where the crossing guard at the corner knew every kid's name. So they said yes. Between 7:50 and 8 o'clock that morning, Marice Ann Chiverella grabbed her school bag, her pocketbook, that little purse that made her feel so grown up, and those canned goods she was so proud to bring. She bundled up against the brutal cold, pulling on her dark jacket over her school skirt, making sure her black leotards were straight, lacing up her suede shoes. She wrapped her multicolored scarf around her neck, the one people back then called a babushka, pulling it snug against the fierce wind that was already howling outside. And then she walked out the door of 533 Alter Street for what would be the last time. The wind that morning wasn't just cold. It was the kind of biting, relentless wind that makes you wonder why anyone would choose to live in northeastern Pennsylvania in March. The temperature had dropped overnight, and now the streets were empty except for a few souls who absolutely had to be out. Marice hustled along the north sidewalk, heading east, her small frame fighting against the gusts that seemed determined to push her back. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, Helen Slattery, who was Marice's mother's cousin, happened to look out her window near 212 West 4th Street, close to Sherman Court. She saw the little girl walking, noticed how she was struggling against that bitter wind, how determined she looked despite the cold. Helen thought about calling Marice inside, about having her come in to warm up for just a few minutes, maybe have a cup of hot cocoa before continuing on to school. Several other neighbors saw her too, and some of them actually called out to her, offering to let her come inside their homes to get out of the cold. But Marice declined every offer. She was on a mission, you see. She had to make it to church on time. She had those canned goods to deliver. She'd made a plan, and she was going to stick to it with the kind of single-minded determination that adults call admirable and kids just call being stubborn. She was just 1 block west of Church Street, which locals called Route 309, walking with purpose despite the weather. That was the last time anyone saw Marice Ann Chiverella alive. Think about that for a moment. In the span of maybe 20 minutes, in broad daylight, on streets where neighbors were looking out their windows, a 9-year-old girl simply vanished. By midday, the usual rhythms of the Chiverella household started to feel wrong. Lunchtime arrived, and the kids usually came home to eat. That was the routine, had been for years. Barry and Carmen Marie walked through the door, their cheeks red from the cold, ready for whatever Mary had prepared. But Marice didn't show up. At first, it was just a little concerning. Maybe she'd stayed after class for something. Maybe she'd gotten caught up talking to Sister Josephine about the feast day preparations. Maybe she'd lost track of time. Their father, Carmen, told Barry and Carmen Marie to head back to school and find their sister, figuring there was a simple explanation. Carmen Marie went straight to Marice's homeroom teacher, expecting to find her sister still there, maybe helping clean erasers or organizing books the way good students did. But the instructor's response made Carmen Marie's stomach drop. "I haven't seen Marice at all today," the teacher said, her voice carrying that first edge of concern. "She's been marked absent all morning." That's when everyone realized something had gone terribly horribly wrong. This wasn't a case of losing track of time or staying late after class. Marice had never made it to school at all. Carmen Chiverella, the father who just hours before had kissed his daughter goodbye and watched her walk out the door, immediately started searching. He went to St. Joseph's Church first, thinking maybe she'd gone there and somehow gotten delayed. He walked the route Marice should have taken, his eyes scanning every doorway, every alley, every corner where a small girl might have stopped. He asked neighbors, knocked on doors, his voice growing more urgent with each passing minute. Then one of the neighborhood women yelled over to him, her face pale, her voice shaking. She asked who and what he was looking for, and when Carmen said he was looking for his daughter, something in her expression changed. "If you're looking for the little girl," she said, and you could hear the weight of terrible news in every word. They found her. About 3 miles away from the Chiverella home, in Hazelton Township, there was an abandoned coal stripping pit. One of those scars on the landscape that northeastern Pennsylvania was covered with, leftovers from decades of anthracite coal mining that had built the region and then slowly destroyed it. The Knox mine disaster in 1959 had been the death knell for deep mining in the area, and now these pits just sat there, forgotten and abandoned, slowly filling with whatever refuse people illegally dumped there. This particular pit was tucked away near Hazelton Municipal Airport, off Airport Road, the kind of place you'd only go if you were dumping trash or teaching someone to drive where there wouldn't be any traffic. At approximately 1 o'clock that afternoon, 38-year-old Arthur F. Robinson drove to the pit with his 16-year-old nephew. He was giving the kid driving lessons, and he'd brought along a container of ashes to dump while they were there. As Robinson looked down into the pit, something caught his eye. At first, and this detail is going to haunt you, he thought it was a large doll. You know how something can look so out of place that your brain tries to make it make sense, tries to turn it into something innocent and explainable? But as he moved closer, getting to about 25 feet down the slope from the top of the garbage dump, his brain stopped trying to protect him and showed him the truth. It was a little girl. Arthur Robinson didn't waste a single second. He immediately left the site and called the Pennsylvania State Police, his hands probably shaking as he dialed, his voice probably cracking as he tried to explain what he'd just seen. Within minutes, and I mean minutes, not the hours or days that investigations sometimes take to get started, police arrived at the scene. But here's something that might surprise you, something that tells you just how different 1964 was from today. Priests from St. Joseph's Church arrived at the scene too. Back then, it was common practice for clergy to show up at death scenes to administer last rites, that Catholic sacrament for the dying that provided spiritual comfort even when physical salvation was impossible. One of those priests looked down at the small body lying at the bottom of that refuse pit, and his face went absolutely pale. He knew her. He recognized her immediately, even from a distance, even in those circumstances. He positively identified her as Marice Ann Chiverella, the little girl who'd wanted to attend morning mass, who dreamed of becoming a nun, who'd walked out of her house just hours earlier with canned goods and hope. Now, I need to warn you, what I'm about to describe is going to be difficult to hear. It's brutal and it's heartbreaking, and part of you might want me to skip over these details. But I can't, and here's why. Understanding the brutality of what happened to this little girl is essential to understanding why this case mattered so much, why investigators couldn't let it go, why they worked on it for 58 years. The violence inflicted on Marice Ann Chiverella wasn't just murder. It was an act of such cruelty that it would haunt everyone who touched this case for the rest of their lives. So let me walk you through what investigators found that day, because these details are going to matter later when we talk about the suspect and when we talk about justice. Marice was found at the bottom of the refuse pit, her small body discarded like trash among the actual garbage that people had illegally dumped there. She was still fully clothed in her dark jacket and skirt, still wearing those black leotards she'd put on that morning, but her suede shoes, the ones she'd carefully laced up before leaving home, were missing from her feet. They were found nearby, along with her school bag, her little pocketbook that made her feel so grown up, and those canned goods she'd been so excited to bring to Sister Josephine. Pears and beets, remember? The gifts that had gotten her out of bed excited that morning were now just evidence in a murder investigation. But it was what had been done to her that made even seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. Her wrists were bound together with one of her own shoelaces, the kind of detail that tells you this was planned, that someone had thought about restraint, about control. Her ankles were bound together with her other shoelace, effectively hobbling her, making it impossible for her to run or fight. And that multicolored scarf she'd wrapped around her neck to protect herself from the cold, that babushka that was supposed to keep her warm, had been stuffed so deep into her mouth and throat that it knocked out one of her teeth. Think about that level of force, that level of violence. The scarf was used as a gag, a way to prevent her from screaming, from calling for help, from being heard. She had been hit twice on top of her head, hit hard enough to cause trauma. She'd been hit once on her right temple. There were strangulation marks around her neck, the kind of marks that tell a story of terror and struggle. Dr. Julius Foss conducted the autopsy at Hazelton State General Hospital, and his official determination was cause of death by asphyxiation and strangulation. Marice Ann Chiverella had been strangled to death. But that wasn't all, and this is where the case becomes even more horrific. She had been sexually assaulted before she died. And here's the thing that would eventually crack this case wide open 58 years later. The killer left something behind. Something invisible to the naked eye, something that wouldn't matter at all in 1964, but would become the key to everything decades later. The killer's bodily fluids were found on her jacket. Now, in 1964, this evidence was essentially meaningless from an identification standpoint. DNA testing didn't exist. The structure of DNA had only been discovered by Watson and Crick in 1953, just 11 years earlier, and that discovery was purely academic at that point. Nobody, not scientists, not police, not prosecutors, understood that genetic material could be used to identify a specific human being. The idea that you could take biological material from a crime scene and use it to point to one person out of billions? That was science fiction. It might as well have been magic. So that evidence was carefully documented, meticulously preserved, and then filed away in a cabinet where it would sit and wait. Wait for science to catch up. Wait for technology to advance. Wait for someone to figure out how to unlock the secrets hidden in those biological traces. That careful preservation, that decision to treat evidence with respect even when they couldn't use it, would turn out to be the most important choice anyone made in this entire case. Let me paint you a picture of Hazelton, Pennsylvania in 1964, because understanding this town is essential to understanding why this case hit so hard, why it changed everything. Hazelton was a coal mining town built by waves of immigrants who came seeking the American dream, or at least their version of it. First came the Germans and Irish back in the 1840s, drawn by the promise of work and land and opportunity. Then came the Italians, Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and Montenegrins in later waves, all of them coming to work the coal mines that seemed to promise steady employment and a chance to build something for their families. These weren't people looking to get rich. They were people looking to survive, to thrive, to give their children better lives than they'd had. By 1964, though, the coal industry was dying a slow, painful death. The Knox mine disaster in 1959 had been the final nail in the coffin for deep mining, one of those catastrophic events that marks the end of an era. The Susquehanna River had broken through into the Knox mine, flooding the entire mine system, and that was basically it for deep coal mining in the region. The industry that had built these towns, that had given them purpose and identity, was gone. But even as the economic foundation crumbled, the community spirit remained alive and strong. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, and I mean everyone. You couldn't walk down the street without running into 3 people who knew your name, your family, probably what you'd had for dinner last night. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on, and that wasn't a suggestion, it was just when you were expected home. Children walked to school by themselves, came home for lunch alone, and nobody thought twice about it, because why would they? Crime, especially violent crime, was something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. It wasn't something that touched your neighborhood, your street, your family. Ron Marchetti, who was the same age as Marice and grew up in Hazelton, remembered it perfectly. Back then, we didn't even lock our doors. You could ask anybody around here my age or who knew that age, and they'll know Chiverella and remember that case. Jake Ripa, a local jeweler who lived just a few blocks away from the Chiverella family, put it this way: the innocence of youth in the community was gone. That was it. There was no more, I'm going down to my friend's house. Mom and Dad were like, we'll take you. Think about what that means. An entire generation's childhood changed in a single day. The day after the murder, Hazelton Mayor Joseph Conahan, who lived just one block from the Chiverella home, whose children had played with Marice and her siblings, made a statement that tried to capture the impossible weight of what had happened. Yesterday's crime makes everyone cognizant that evil constantly is present and heinous murders can happen here. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The assumption of safety that had defined small-town American life, that belief that bad things happened elsewhere, had evaporated in a single morning. Joseph Yanuzzi, who was 27 years old at the time and would later become Hazelton's mayor, remembered the fear that settled over the town like a fog. It was scary in a sense that this happened. Murder, let alone rape, let alone a child. It was terrible. He looked at his adopted son and wondered what kind of world he was bringing him into, what kind of place this town had become. It was the end of an era, the death of innocence, and everyone felt it. The funeral was massive in the way that small-town tragedies are, where grief becomes communal and everyone shows up, because not showing up would be unthinkable. The church was packed to capacity, standing room only, with people spilling out into the streets. The lines at the viewing stretched out the funeral home doors and around the block. Hundreds of people waiting hours just to pay their respects, to see Marice one last time, to tell the family that they were sorry, that they were thinking of them, that they couldn't imagine what they were going through. When the coffin was closed for the final time, Marice's mother, Mary, gave her daughter one final farewell kiss, her hand resting on that closed casket, her heart breaking in ways that would never fully heal. A mother isn't supposed to outlive her child. It goes against the natural order of things, against everything we believe about how life should work. And for 58 years, Marice Chiverella would pray for one thing and one thing only: that the Pennsylvania State Police would find the man who hurt her daughter. Not revenge, not punishment, just answers, just justice. Before we move forward into the investigation, I want you to do something for me. If you're watching this and thinking about all the cold cases that remain unsolved, all the families still waiting for answers, hit that like button. It tells YouTube's algorithm to show this video to more people, and the more people who see how these cases get solved, the more pressure there is to never give up on justice. Because that's what this story is really about, never giving up, even when it seems impossible, even when decades pass, even when everyone who was there at the beginning is gone. Now let's talk about what happened next, about the investigation that would span nearly 6 decades and involve more than 230 Pennsylvania State Police officers. The Pennsylvania State Police at the Hazelton Barracks responded to the discovery of Marice's body with the kind of intensity and dedication that defines the best of law enforcement. Retired Trooper Donald Good was one of the first responders, and what happened next would become a defining period not just in his career, but in his life. The investigation team worked 20-hour days, 7 days a week, without a single day off from March through mid-July of 1964. Let that sink in for a moment. That's approximately 4 months of intensive, round-the-clock investigation where these men essentially lived at the barracks or out on the streets, following leads, conducting interviews, documenting everything. They weren't going home to have dinner with their families. They weren't taking weekends off to decompress. They were consumed by this case, driven by the need to find whoever had done this to a 9-year-old girl and make sure they never hurt anyone else. They interviewed hundreds of people: neighbors, family members, teachers, priests, store owners, anyone who might have seen something or heard something or known something. They documented everything with meticulous care, compiling over 4,600 pages of investigative documents during those initial months, a number that would eventually grow to 6,000 pages over the decades as the case stayed active. And here's the decision that would prove to be absolutely crucial. They carefully preserved every piece of physical evidence, including Marice's clothing. In 1964, when forensic science was incredibly limited and they had no idea what future technology might make possible, these investigators made the choice to treat every piece of evidence as potentially important. They didn't know about DNA testing, couldn't have known, because the technology was decades away from being developed. But they preserved everything anyway, just in case, just because it was the right thing to do, just because this little girl deserved their best effort. That decision, made by men whose names we'll never all know, would turn out to be the single most important factor in eventually solving this case. But let's be honest about what they were up against. Forensic science in 1964 was incredibly, almost laughably limited compared to what we have today. There was no DNA testing, no computers, no national databases, no way to effectively share information across jurisdictions. If you wanted to check something against records from another state, you were making phone calls and sending physical documents through the mail. Blood typing could only determine 4 basic categories: A, B, AB, and O. That's it. And you know how many people share the same blood type? Millions. Tens of millions. Blood type could eliminate suspects, but it couldn't definitively identify anyone. Fingerprints had to be compared manually by someone actually looking at 2 sets of prints side by side and trying to match the whirls and loops. Crime scene investigation was rudimentary at best. They were taking photographs and making sketches, but they didn't have the sophisticated forensic tools we take for granted today. Without DNA and without witnesses who could positively identify the perpetrator, investigators were essentially working in the dark, following every lead they had and hoping something would break. And they did follow every lead, no matter how tenuous. One man who owed money to Carmen Chiverella's grocery store confessed to the crime. Just straight up confessed, walked into the police station, and said he'd done it. Investigators brought him in for detailed questioning, probably feeling that rush of hope that comes with thinking you've caught your killer. The man said he'd strangled Marice with his hands, described it in detail, seemed genuinely remorseful. But here's the thing. Police knew she'd been strangled with her own shoelaces, not with hands. The physical evidence didn't match his confession. The confession was false, one of those strange psychological phenomena where people confess to crimes they didn't commit for reasons psychologists still don't fully understand. Maybe he felt guilty about something else. Maybe he wanted attention. Maybe he was mentally ill. Whatever the reason, he wasn't the killer, and investigators knew it. Another man was scheduled for a polygraph test, one of those suspects who'd popped up during the investigation for reasons that seemed promising at the time. The night before the test, he drove to the area near the pit where Marice's body had been found. He parked his car. He let the motor run. And he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Was it suicide? Was he the killer who couldn't face being caught? Was it just a tragic accident? Nobody knew for sure, and without modern forensic techniques, there was no way to definitively connect him to the crime. The case file would forever contain that question mark, that what if that investigators would turn over in their minds for years. A young man with psychological challenges was observed in the woods near the dumping site, either during or shortly after the crime. He may have witnessed the murder or the body being dumped, may have seen something that could have broken the case wide open. But his account was difficult to verify, complicated by his mental state and the challenges of getting clear, consistent information from him. Was he a witness? Was he involved? Or was he just someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? The investigators did their best, but without concrete evidence, there was only so far they could go. Police even investigated a possible connection to a similar case, the 1962 murder of 9-year-old Carol and Doherty in Bristol, Pennsylvania. She'd been found strangled in St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church choir loft, another young girl killed in a Catholic setting, another case that shocked a community. The similarities were striking enough that investigators had to consider a connection. They discovered that approximately 1,000 people from Bristol had been in Hazelton for a high school basketball playoff game the night before Marice was killed. Could the same person have killed both girls? Was there a connection they were missing? But despite extensive investigation, no confirmed connection was ever established. Sometimes what looks like a lead turns out to be just a coincidence, just the universe being cruel by presenting patterns where none exist. The investigation team. And here's something that retired corporals Thomas McAndrew and Sean Williams would emphasize decades later, was following the right leads and asking the right questions. When cold case investigators looked back at the 1964 investigation with the benefit of modern knowledge and experience, they recognized that the original team had done everything right. They'd asked the questions that today's investigators would ask. They'd followed the leads that made sense. They'd documented everything properly. They'd preserved evidence with care. They hadn't missed something obvious or made some crucial mistake that let the killer slip through their fingers. They'd done good work, solid work, the kind of investigative work that should have resulted in an arrest and conviction. But there was one massive, insurmountable problem. The killer's name never came up. Not once. Not in any interview. Not in any tip. Not in any witness statement. He was a ghost, invisible, someone who existed outside the investigation's scope entirely. And that's not because the investigators failed. It's because sometimes the person who commits a crime has no apparent connection to the victim, no presence in their social circle, no reason to come to anyone's attention. More than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police would work on this case over the next 58 years. Think about that number, 230 officers, spanning 3 generations, all touching this case in some way. Some worked on it for years. Some reviewed it for a few months. Some spent just a few days reading through files and following up on old leads. But they all became part of Marice's story, all contributed to the eventual solution in ways big and small. The Pennsylvania State Police reviewed the case annually. Every single year, they pulled out those files and went through them again, looking for something they might have missed, hoping that new technology or new techniques might provide a breakthrough. They maintained monthly contact with the Chiverella family throughout the decades, calling them every month to say, "We haven't forgotten. We're still working on this. We're still here." Can you imagine what that meant to the family? In a world where cold cases often go silent, where families stop hearing from police because there's nothing new to report, the Pennsylvania State Police never let the Chiverella family feel abandoned or forgotten. Retired Trooper Donald Good's wife noted something that perfectly captures the dedication these officers had to this case. Every year on the anniversary of Marice's death, every single March 18th for decades, her husband would bring up her name. "Another year has passed," he'd say, his voice heavy with the weight of all that time. Another year without answers. It wasn't just his job anymore. It had become personal. Marice wasn't just a case number or a file in a cabinet. She was a little girl who deserved justice, and he couldn't let her be forgotten. That's the kind of commitment that defines the best of law enforcement. When a case becomes more than just work, when it becomes a promise you've made to someone who can't speak for themselves anymore. But let me tell you about Marice Chiverella, Marice's mother, because her story is both beautiful and heartbreaking in ways that will stay with you long after this video ends. She saved every letter and sympathy card received after her daughter's murder. Every single one. Cards from neighbors, from distant relatives, from people she barely knew who'd been touched by the tragedy. She kept them in a box, and sometimes she'd take them out and read through them, reminding herself that people cared, that Marice had mattered, that her daughter's life had touched others. She told her family that having Marice, even for just 9 years, was a blessing. That's the kind of grace that's almost impossible to comprehend. To lose your child in such a horrific way and still be able to say that having her at all was a gift. Ron Chiverella, Marice's oldest brother, remembered something that would become a defining ritual of their family life for the next 5 decades. At every Sunday dinner, every holiday meal, every time the family gathered together to share food and fellowship, his mother would end grace with the same prayer. "Please help the Pennsylvania State Police find the man that hurt my daughter." Year after year after year, the same words, the same plea, the same hope that somehow, someway, answers would come. Eventually, Mary reached a point where she did something that most of us probably couldn't do. She forgave the man who took her daughter, even though she never knew his name. She forgave him not because he deserved forgiveness, not because what he did was excusable, but because she needed to find peace, because carrying that hatred and anger was destroying her as surely as the grief was. It was an act of extraordinary grace, the kind of forgiveness that transcends human understanding. Marice Chiverella died in 2014, 50 years after her daughter's murder. 50 years of praying, 50 years of hoping, 50 years of asking the Pennsylvania State Police to find the man who hurt her little girl. She died without knowing who killed Marice. Carmen Chiverella, the father who'd searched desperately for his daughter that March afternoon, who'd owned the little grocery store where Marice picked out canned goods, had died years earlier. Both parents went to their graves without answers, carrying that burden of not knowing until their last breaths. The 4 surviving siblings, Ron, Carmen Marie, Barry, and David, carried the weight of their sister's unsolved murder for their entire adult lives. Imagine growing up with that shadow, with that absence, with that question mark that defined your family. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering had Marice's absence written all over it. Every time they passed her grave, every time someone mentioned 1964, every time they heard about another cold case being solved, they wondered if maybe, just maybe, their turn would come. But they held on to hope because the Pennsylvania State Police had promised them something, and they kept that promise year after year. The police promised they would never stop looking, never stop trying, never give up on finding who killed Marice. And unlike so many promises made to families of victims, this one was kept. In 2007, something extraordinary happened. 43 years after the murder, long enough for entire generations to grow up, graduate, get married, have children of their own, technology finally caught up to the evidence that had been sitting in a Pennsylvania State Police storage facility since 1964. The Pennsylvania State Police DNA laboratory developed a suspect DNA profile from the killer's bodily fluids found on Marice's jacket. Let me say that again because it's absolutely crucial. 43 years after investigators carefully preserved that evidence, not knowing if it would ever be useful, scientists were finally able to extract a genetic profile from it. The decision to preserve that jacket, to document that evidence, to treat it with care even though they couldn't use it, that decision made decades earlier by officers who never lived to see this breakthrough, finally paid off. This was the moment when the case transformed from impossible to solvable, even though nobody realized it yet. DNA profiles were developed for all the original suspects from 1964, the men who'd been interviewed, questioned, investigated, cleared, or lost in the shuffle of time. Those profiles were submitted to the DNA lab for comparison against the killer's profile. And one by one, they came back negative. None of them matched. Every single original suspect was eliminated. The man who'd confessed falsely? Not him. The man who died of carbon monoxide poisoning? Not him either. Every lead they'd followed for 4 decades, every person they'd investigated, every suspect they'd considered, none of them were the killer. It was devastating in a way to realize that all that work, all those man-hours, all those leads had been pointing in the wrong direction the entire time. But it was also clarifying, because now they knew for certain that they were looking for someone outside their original investigation scope, someone who'd never come to their attention at all. The killer's DNA profile was then entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which is the national database containing profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples from unsolved crimes. This is the system you hear about on crime shows, the one that's supposed to find matches and solve cases. Lieutenant Devin Bertosky later explained what happened next, and his words capture both the hope and frustration of modern forensic investigation. Since 2007, the killer's DNA profile has been checked monthly against all new entries in our DNA databases. Monthly. For over 12 years. 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Every single month for 144 months, the system would run the comparison, looking for a match. And every single month, the result came back the same: no match. Not a single one. The technology existed. The DNA profile was solid. The system was working exactly as designed. But there was no match because of one simple, frustrating fact. The killer had died in 1980, before DNA databasing became standard practice. His DNA wasn't in any criminal database because he died before such databases existed. He'd gotten away with murder not because he was smart or careful or lucky, but simply because he died before science caught up to him. So once again, the case went cold. The evidence existed. The DNA profile existed. The technology existed. But without a database match, they were stuck. Investigators continued their annual reviews, continued their monthly contact with the family, continued to hope that somehow, someway, something would break. And then something did, though it would take a convergence of new technology, private companies, and one remarkably dedicated college student to make it happen. In 2018, everything changed in the world of cold case investigation because of a case you've probably heard of, the Golden State Killer. But before we get to that, the Pennsylvania State Police made a decision that showed just how committed they were to solving Marice's case. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology and genetic genealogy company that was pioneering techniques that seemed almost like science fiction. This wasn't traditional forensic DNA analysis where you're just trying to match one profile to another. This was something revolutionary, something that opened up entirely new possibilities. On March 20th, 2019, the Pennsylvania State Police released composite images created by Parabon's Snapshot Forensic DNA Phenotyping System. using deep data mining and advanced machine learning algorithms, technology that literally didn't exist a decade earlier. The system analyzed the killer's DNA to predict his physical characteristics based on genetic markers. The results were specific and striking. Ancestry, European/white. Hair color, dark/brown. Eye color, blue or green. Skin tone, fair with possible freckling. The composites showed what the suspect would have looked like at ages 25, 40, and 60, accounting for the aging process that everyone undergoes. The images were released to the public via Pennsylvania State Police social media accounts and press releases, shared across Facebook and Twitter and local news stations. Maybe someone would recognize him. Maybe someone would remember a neighbor, a coworker, a family member who looked like these composites. Maybe someone would come forward with information that would finally break the case open. The Chiverella family and investigator associations provided funding for the expensive forensic DNA study because state budgets don't always cover cutting-edge technology, especially for cold cases. These families and these organizations believed so strongly in the possibility of justice that they put their money where their hope was. But the real breakthrough came from a different technology entirely, one that would revolutionize cold case investigation in ways nobody could have predicted. In 2019, Parabon uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED-Match, a public genealogy database. Now, this was fundamentally different from Cody's. Cody's only contains DNA from convicted offenders and arrestees, people who've been forced to provide their DNA as part of the criminal justice system. GED-Match contains DNA uploaded by consumers who've taken commercial ancestry tests, regular people doing genealogy research, looking for biological relatives, building family trees, trying to figure out if they're related to someone famous or interesting. These are people who voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to a public database, never imagining that their DNA might someday help solve a murder. The upload found a match, though not the kind of match you might expect. It wasn't the killer. It was a very distant relative, approximately a sixth cousin, a match of about 53 centimorgans, which is a measure of genetic linkage that tells you how much DNA two people share. Lieutenant Devin Bertosky explained, "We got a match somewhere around a sixth cousin, a very distant match that narrowed down suspects." Now, 53 centimorgans doesn't sound like much, and honestly, it wasn't much. To give you perspective, you share about 3,400 centimorgans with a parent or child, about 1,700 with a sibling, about 850 with a first cousin. 53 centimorgans means you're looking at someone who shares a great-great-great-great-grandparent with the killer, maybe someone born in the early 1800s, someone who had multiple children, who had multiple children, who had multiple children, creating a family tree that branches out into potentially thousands of living descendants. It was like finding a single thread in a massive tapestry and trying to follow it back through 6 generations to find the person at the other end. But it was a thread. It was something, and someone was about to pull it. Before we meet the teenager who cracked this case wide open, I want to ask you something. Are you subscribed to Cold Case Desk yet? If not, seriously, what are you waiting for? We cover the cases that never got solved until suddenly they did. The ones where science and persistence finally caught up to evil. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss how justice finally catches up, even decades later. Now, let's talk about Eric Schubert, because his story is almost as remarkable as the case itself. It was February of 2020, and Eric Schubert was an 18-year-old college freshman at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He was a history major from Medford Lakes, New Jersey, a regular kid by most measures, except for one thing. He'd been doing genealogy research since he was 8 years old. 10 years of experience by the time he was 18, which is extraordinary when you think about it. He'd discovered genealogy when he learned his grandmother was adopted, and that mystery sparked something in him that became a passion, then a skill, then eventually a calling. He started building family trees, tracking down birth certificates and marriage records and census data, learning how to navigate the Byzantine world of genealogical research where every answer leads to 3 more questions. And he got good at it. Really good. By 18, he'd already helped police departments near Philadelphia and Chicago solve cold cases, work that would be impressive for someone with a PhD and decades of experience. He'd even started his own business, Genealogy, working cases in his spare time between classes and homework. One night in February 2020, he was reading about cold cases in Pennsylvania, maybe procrastinating on homework, maybe just following his passion, and Hazelton was only about 80 miles from his college. When he came across an article about Marice and Chiverella's case, specifically the March 2019 release of the Parabon DNA phenotyping composites, he couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about this case that grabbed him, that wouldn't let go. Maybe it was the age of the case. Maybe it was the brutality of what happened to Marice. Maybe it was just the challenge of it. Whatever the reason, he did something most 18-year-olds wouldn't have the courage to do. He sent an email to the Pennsylvania State Police. Just reached out cold, introducing himself, explaining his experience, and offering to help. Just reaching out and saying, "Hey, I think I know what I'm doing. If I'm not stepping on any toes, I'd be happy to help," Schubert recalled years later. "I didn't think that would work, but it did, and I'm very thankful for that." Lieutenant Devin Bertosky received that email, an 18-year-old kid offering to help solve a 56-year-old murder, and he had a decision to make. Most law enforcement agencies would have ignored it, maybe sent a polite "thanks but no thanks" response. I mean, come on, an 18-year-old college freshman? But Bertosky did something smart. He vetted Schubert. He looked into the previous cold cases he'd helped solve. He checked his credentials. He talked to other departments that had worked with him. And he recognized that this was outside the box, way outside the box of how state police typically operated, but sometimes thinking outside the box is exactly what a cold case needs. So he made a decision that would change everything. They accepted Schubert's offer. Schubert would work on the case for free, no payment, no contract, just a kid who wanted to help solve a murder because it was the right thing to do. He was given access to a partial case file containing the suspect's DNA profile and a list of potential matches from GeneMatch. His assignment: build family trees from distant DNA matches to identify the killer through genealogical research. His starting point was daunting. Approximately 2,000 people who might be shared ancestors with whoever committed the crime, and that 53 centimorgan match, a sixth cousin relationship. To put this in perspective, imagine you're trying to find a specific person in a crowd of 2,000 people, and your only clue is that one of those people has a great-great-great-great-grandparent in common with the person you're looking for. You don't know which of the 2,000 it is. You don't know what the connection looks like. You don't know if the family tree goes through sons or daughters, through which siblings, through which marriages. You just know that somewhere in this massive tangle of genealogical connections, there's a thread that leads to a killer. That's what Eric Schubert was working with, and he dove in with the kind of dedication that would have been impressive in anyone, let alone a college freshman. Throughout the remainder of 2020 and all of 2021, Eric Schubert worked. He spent up to 20 hours per week on the case. That's a part-time job on top of being a full-time college student. He was building family trees, studying distant matches, constantly asking investigators for more DNA samples to test, trying to narrow down the possibilities. While he explored genealogical family names during his research, one surname emerged that changed everything: Palomo. State police troopers immediately recognized the name because they had long institutional memories and good record-keeping. Renata Palomo had been shot dead outside her home on Buck Mountain Road in Luzerne Township, Carbon County, back in the 1970s, a completely different case, but connected through genealogy. DNA related to that investigation confirmed that investigators were on the right ancestral track, that they were following the right family lines backward through time. The connection led them to retired New Jersey State Police Captain John Paul Palomo, who, when contacted by investigators, referred them to another family member, someone who kept an extensive family tree, a family historian who'd been documenting their lineage for years. This was the genealogical framework they needed, the skeleton on which they could build their investigation. Throughout 2020 and 2021, investigators interviewed numerous Palomo relatives, asking for voluntary DNA samples, explaining what they were trying to do, hoping that family members would cooperate with an investigation into a murder committed decades earlier. And fortunately, the family did cooperate. They understood what was at stake. They understood that somewhere in their family tree, there might be a killer, and they wanted the truth as much as anyone. Schubert built extensive family trees, working to narrow down from distant matches to closer relatives, slowly and painstakingly following the genetic threads forward through generations. The DNA match climbed: 53 centimorgans, 100 centimorgans, 500 centimorgans. Eventually, They got over 1,000 centimorgans, which indicated a half-uncle or first-cousin level relationship. They were getting closer. The net was tightening. Somewhere in this family tree was the person they were looking for. In 2020, the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab established a Y chromosome DNA profile for the suspect. The Y chromosome is inherited through the paternal line only. Fathers pass it to sons in an essentially exact match through male lineages, which means it can help confirm you're tracking the right family line even when autosomal DNA gets complicated through multiple generations. This helped confirm they were on the right track, that all this work was leading somewhere real. Finally, after months of building trees and testing DNA and following leads, the research narrowed the suspect pool to 4 individuals. For men, one of whom had been arrested in 1974 for an unrelated sexual assault. His name was James Paul Forte. And when investigators started digging into James Paul Forte's background, their blood ran cold, because what they found was even worse than they'd imagined. James Paul Forte was born on July 21, 1941, in Hazelton, Pennsylvania, the same town where Marice Ann Chiverella would be born 13 years later. He graduated from Hazelton High School in 1959, and his yearbook entry paints a picture of a seemingly normal teenager. The description reads like thousands of other yearbook entries from that era: tall, blue-eyed, and handsome. Loves to sleep. Sports are his favorite, especially baseball. Future undecided. That last part turned out to be prophetic in the darkest way possible. His future was undecided, unplanned, directionless in a way that would lead to tragedy. After high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Army on October 16, 1959. He served for 3 years and was discharged on September 28, 1962. Military service was common for young men in that era, almost expected, and nothing in his service record suggested anything unusual or concerning. He came home to Hazelton, returned to civilian life, and disappeared into the community, just another working-class guy trying to make his way in a dying coal town. Forte never married. He had no known children. People who knew him described him as living a muted life, keeping to himself, not causing problems, but not particularly memorable either. He worked as a bartender and bar supplies salesman, jobs that put him in contact with people but didn't require deep personal connections. He was the kind of person who could serve you a drink, chat about the weather or last night's game, and you'd never remember him the next day. Invisible in plain sight. In 1964, when he murdered Marice Ann Chiverella, he was 22 years old, young, strong, capable. And here's what made investigators' blood run cold when they finally identified him. James Paul Forte lived in Hazelton, and not just anywhere in Hazelton. Multiple addresses were documented over the years, and each one tells a story that becomes more disturbing the more you think about it. He lived at 118 West 14th Street, directly across the street from St. Joseph Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery, the cemetery where Marice Ann Chiverella was buried. James Paul Forte lived with a direct view of her grave. Every day, he could look out his window and see where they'd laid her to rest. He could watch the family visit on anniversaries. He could see the flowers left on her headstone. He lived there, looking at what he'd done, and it didn't drive him to confess. It didn't haunt him into turning himself in. He just lived there, keeping his secret. He also lived at 745 North Laurel Street and 770 North Laurel Street at different times. All of these addresses were approximately 6 to 7 blocks from the Chiverella family home at 533 Alter Street. 6 blocks. That's a 10-minute walk, maybe less. Close enough that he could have passed the family on the street. Close enough that he might have shopped at Carmen Chiverella's grocery store. Might have bought cigarettes or beer from the man whose daughter he'd murdered. The proximity is chilling. The idea that the Chiverella family lived all those years not knowing that their daughter's killer was right there, walking the same streets, breathing the same air, living his life while theirs was shattered. Authorities determined that James Paul Forte had no known connection to Marice Ann Chiverella or her family. Police described the attack as random, a crime of opportunity, a little girl walking alone on a cold morning, vulnerable and available. One source indicated that Forte was technically Chiverella's 6th cousin through some distant family connection that nobody knew about or would have recognized, but authorities could find no actual connection between them. They didn't know each other. Their families didn't socialize. There was no relationship, no interaction, No reason for him to target her specifically except that she was there and she was alone. State Trooper James Kiro emphasized an important point when the case was finally solved. Forte acted alone. His family had no knowledge of what he did, so people have to remember not to vilify them. The Forte family can't atone for his crimes. They didn't know, couldn't have known, and shouldn't be held responsible for the evil he committed. Corporal Mark Barron, who had become the lead investigator by 2020, read all approximately 5,000 pages of investigation files. "I've read the report," he said. "He's not there. Forte's name does not appear anywhere in the investigation files compiled over 58 years. He was not part of the initial murder investigation. He was never interviewed. He was never considered a suspect. He was never even a person of interest. He was completely invisible to the investigation, which continued working other leads, other suspects, other theories, while he walked free just blocks away." It's the kind of thing that makes you realize how difficult police work really is, how many people live in any given area, how impossible it is to investigate everyone when you have no reason to focus on any particular person. But here's the thing that made investigators absolutely certain they had the right man. The thing that connected James Paul Forte not just to Marice's murder, but to a pattern of violence. 10 years after he murdered Marice Ann Chiverella, he did it again. Not murder, but close. Close enough that if there had been any justice in the world, close enough that he should have gone to prison for decades. On April 3, 1974, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a 23-year-old woman went with Forte to the Capri Lounge at Alter and 2nd Streets. She was visiting a friend in the area, and Forte offered her a ride home when she was ready to leave. She accepted, probably not thinking twice about it, because this was still small-town Pennsylvania where people helped each other out. But instead of taking her home, Forte drove to Stockton Mountain Road in Hazelton Township, a secluded area, isolated, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream, and he violently attacked her. The victim was sexually assaulted in what investigators later described as a very violent encounter, language that's deliberately vague because the details are horrific and the victim deserves privacy even decades later. When a truck stopped behind Forte's car, just random chance, someone else driving on that isolated road in the early morning. He fled the scene, probably afraid of being caught, probably calculating that running was better than being identified. He eventually let the woman out at West Broad and Vine Streets, just dropped her there and drove away like nothing had happened. She walked home, traumatized and injured. She called friends and police, did everything right, reported the crime immediately. She was taken to the hospital for examination and treatment. A search warrant was served on Forte's vehicle, and police retrieved hair samples from the front seat and mud indicating the car had been driven in the area where the assault took place. The evidence was there. The victim identified him. This should have been an open and shut case. On April 13, 1974, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper James Gibb charged James Paul Forte with involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, indecent assault, and aggravated assault. Forte was released on $5,000 bail, which he presumably paid or had someone pay for him, and then he waited for his trial, living his life, working his job, probably confident that he'd get away with it just like he'd gotten away with murder. And then something happened that should make every person watching this absolutely furious, something that represents a complete failure of the justice system. On September 18, 1974, Forte pleaded guilty to aggravated assault only. Prosecutors withdrew the sexual assault and indecent assault charges, just withdrew them, dropped them, made them disappear. On October 2, 1974, Judge Bernard C. Berminski sentenced James Paul Forte to 1 year of special probation supervised by the Pennsylvania Probation and Parole Office. He was ordered to pay the victim's hospital bill. That's it. No prison time. No serious consequences. No sex offender registration because that didn't exist yet. A violent sexual predator who'd assaulted a woman in a manner that investigators described as extremely violent walked free with probation and a bill to pay. Think about that. Think about what message that sent to Forte about accountability, about consequences, about whether he could get away with violence. Now let me connect the dots for you, because the parallels between the 1974 assault and the 1964 murder are chilling in their similarity. Both involved violent sexual assault. That's the core pattern. Both occurred in the Hazelton/Hazel Township area, his hunting ground, the place he knew well enough to find isolated locations. Both involved Forte using his vehicle to transport victims, which gave him mobility and opportunity. Both attacks occurred in secluded, isolated locations where victims couldn't be seen or heard. He chose his locations carefully. Both victims were physically restrained, showing a need for control and domination. Both were described as extremely violent encounters by investigators who'd seen plenty of violence in their careers. The key differences? The 1974 victim was an adult who survived and could identify him. Marice was a 9-year-old child who was murdered, who couldn't testify against him, whose death meant he faced no immediate consequences. And here's the tragedy that will haunt you. At the time of Forte's 1974 arrest and trial, investigators working the Chiverella case were unaware of the connection. How could they be? Forte's name had never come up in the investigation. DNA technology did not exist. There was no way to connect the 1974 attack to the 1964 murder using the forensic tools available at the time. Different victims, different circumstances, no obvious connection. Had DNA analysis been available in 1974, Marice's case might have been solved 48 years earlier. Had someone thought to compare the 1974 assault to unsolved cases in the area, maybe a detective with good instincts would have made the connection. But it didn't happen. Instead, James Paul Forte received a slap on the wrist and continued living his life, probably confident that he was untouchable. For years later, in 1978, he was arrested again by Hazelton police for reckless endangerment and harassment. Police were called to the area of Manhattan Court and 11th Streets for a report of a man running with a gun. What happened with that case? Nobody knows. The records are lost to time, buried in filing cabinets, or destroyed in routine document purges. Did he plead guilty to a lesser charge? Did the case get dismissed? Did he pay a fine? We don't know, but the pattern is clear. James Paul Forte was a violent man who the justice system repeatedly failed to hold accountable. But on May 16, 1980, James Paul Forte's story came to an end in a way that seemed almost anticlimactic given the violence he'd committed. He was 38 years old, working as a bartender at Genetti's Best Western Motor Lodge on Route 93, also called Route 309, in Hazel Township. He collapsed at work. Heart attack or heart failure. Authorities believe it was natural causes, though nobody investigated too carefully, because why would they? He was just a bartender who'd had some legal trouble years earlier, nothing that would warrant special attention. He was dead upon arrival at the hospital. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. James Paul Forte died believing he had gotten away with murder. For 42 years, his secret was safe, buried as surely as he was. His name never came up. The DNA technology that would eventually catch him didn't exist. The genetic genealogy that would unmask him was decades away. He lived his life, worked his jobs, probably congratulated himself on his cleverness, on his luck, on getting away with the perfect crime. But DNA doesn't die. DNA doesn't forget. And in December of 2021, investigators made a decision that would finally bring James Paul Forte to justice, even though he'd been dead for over 4 decades. They were going to bring his DNA out of the grave. If you're still watching, drop a comment below telling me what you think about genetic genealogy. Is it justice finally catching up, or is it an invasion of privacy? Let's talk about it because this technology is controversial and the debate matters. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because we're about to get to the most dramatic moment of this entire story, the moment when investigators literally brought a killer out of his grave. Let's keep going. Police met with the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office to determine their next steps. And this was a crucial meeting because what they were about to do was unprecedented in Pennsylvania. They had strong genealogical evidence pointing to James Paul Forte, family trees, DNA matches, connections that all led to one name. But strong genealogical evidence isn't the same as proof, and you can't close a case, can't give a family final answers, based on probabilities and family trees alone. They needed a positive identification through direct DNA comparison. They needed to be absolutely certain, beyond any shadow of doubt, that James Paul Forte was the man who murdered Marice Ann Chiverella. And there was only one way to do that: exhumation. They had to dig up his body, extract tissue samples, and compare his DNA directly to the DNA found on Marice's jacket 58 years earlier. On January 6, 2022, 41 years, 7 months, and 21 days after James Paul Forte died, investigators obtained a search warrant authorizing the exhumation. Think about what that means for a moment. A search warrant for a dead man's body. A legal document giving authorities permission to disturb a grave, to bring someone out of the ground, to take tissue samples from a corpse that had been buried for over 4 decades. It's not something police do lightly. It's expensive, it's complicated, it's controversial, and it requires convincing a judge that there's sufficient probable cause to believe this extraordinary step is necessary. But the evidence was strong enough, the case was important enough, and the judge agreed. His body was exhumed from Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Pennsylvania, a process that was conducted with the cooperation of Calvary Cemetery officials and the assistance of the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office. It's not a pleasant process. Exhumation rarely is, but it was necessary. A tissue sample was obtained for DNA comparison, carefully preserved and documented, then sent to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab. And then they waited. The results came back on February 3, 2022. The DNA profile from James Paul Forte's exhumed remains matched the DNA profile from the semen stain on Marice Ann Chiverella's jacket. The match probability, 1 in 480 septillion. Let me put that in perspective one more time, because I need you to understand how astronomically certain this is. Scientists estimate that approximately 117 billion people have ever lived on Earth throughout all of human history, from the first Homo sapiens walking out of Africa to every person alive today. To find another person with this same DNA profile, you would need to search over 4 million planet Earths, each with a complete human history spanning 300,000 years. The certainty is absolute. The Y chromosome DNA profile also matched, providing additional confirmation through the paternal line. There was no doubt, no wiggle room, no possibility of a mistake. After 57 years, 10 months, and 23 days, the Pennsylvania State Police had identified Marice Ann Chiverella's killer, James Paul Forte, the man who lived 6 blocks away, the man whose name never appeared in the investigation, the man who could see her grave from his window, the man who got away with murder for his entire life until science finally caught up to him. Deputy District Attorney Daniel Zola would later say something that perfectly captured the moment, and his words deserve to be remembered. Forte may have thought he took his secret to the grave, but we brought him out of the ground and took his DNA. That's not just a statement of fact. It's a declaration of determination, a promise to every killer who thinks they've gotten away with it that eventually, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but eventually, justice will find you. Even death isn't an escape. Even the grave isn't protection. Science keeps advancing, technology keeps improving, and your secret isn't as safe as you think it is. At 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference at the Hazelton Township Commons building. The room was packed. Dozens of family members, friends, law enforcement officials, and community members who had covered or followed the case over decades filled every available space. The energy in that room must have been electric, a mixture of grief and relief, sadness and triumph. Decades of waiting finally coming to an end. Present at the press conference were Lieutenant Devin Bertosky, who'd taken that chance on an 18-year-old's email. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator who'd devoted years to this case and who would break down in tears during his statement. Pennsylvania State Trooper Anthony Petrosky, the public information officer. Trooper James Kiro, Luzerne County District Attorney Sam Singwadals, and Deputy District Attorney Daniel Zola. Eric Schubert, the genealogist, now 20 years old, who'd spent 2 years and hundreds of hours building family trees for a little girl he never met. And retired officials who'd worked the case decades earlier. Sergeant Donald Good, age 89, an original 1964 investigator who'd thought about Marice every year on the anniversary of her death. Corporals Thomas McAndrew and Sean Williams, recent retirees who'd reviewed the case and confirmed the original investigators did everything right. Captain Brian Tobin, retired. Lou Rossi, retired. Generations of investigators, all there to see this through. The Chiverella siblings were there. Carmen Marie Ratke, Marice's sister. Ronald Chiverella, Marice's brother. Barry Chiverella, Marice's brother. David Chiverella, Marice's brother. All of them in their 60s and 70s now. All of them carrying this weight their entire adult lives. All of them about to finally get answers. Their parents, Carmen and Mary, weren't there. They'd both died without ever knowing who killed their daughter, without ever hearing that their prayers had been answered. That absence must have been palpable in the room. The people who wanted this most, who prayed for it longest, weren't there to see it. Corporal Mark Barron stepped up to speak first, and his voice was already shaking. This is a very important day for our department. It is also an important day for the Hazelton community as a whole. This was a violent and heinous crime that was committed against a small child. He paused, struggling with emotion. This is the fourth oldest cold case in the nation to be solved utilizing this technology, which makes it the oldest in the state. This is a day the family has been waiting for nearly 58 years. Barron became visibly emotional throughout his statement, breaking down in tears at times, pausing to compose himself before continuing. You have to understand, investigators are trained not to get emotional, trained to maintain professional distance, trained to compartmentalize. But some cases break through those defenses, and Marice's case was one of them. We're always told not to get attached to a case, Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. But you can't help it. It's a vivid memory for everybody who lived through this, and it's a vivid memory for everybody who grew up in this area. What happened to her ushered in a change in this community. Whether you like it or not, the way you live changed after March 18, 1964, in Hazelton. He continued, and these words need to be heard by every family still waiting for answers. Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think this should instill in the families of victims across the state and across the country a sense of hope. And that hope is that no matter how long it may take, we as law enforcement will never give up in trying to find the perpetrators of these heinous crimes that go on. Lieutenant Devin Bertosky spoke next, and he provided a detail that puts the entire investigation in perspective. Pennsylvania State Police was founded in 1905. So over half of our existence, we've investigated this case. Think about that for a moment. The Pennsylvania State Police had spent more than half of its entire organizational history working on this single case. More than half of its existence as an institution was dedicated, in part, to finding justice for a 9-year-old girl. That's commitment. That's dedication. That's what real justice looks like. Not fast, not flashy, just persistent, methodical work spanning generations. District Attorney Sam Sengwadals addressed the room with a statement that captured both the triumph and the frustration. The dedication to this case is what solved it. It is our greatest regret that we can't prosecute this individual, but as the family says, he will see vengeance. Because that's the reality of solving a case when the perpetrator is dead. There's no trial, no conviction, no sentencing, no prison time. Justice is limited to the truth, to identification, to finally knowing who did it. It's something, but it's not everything. Deputy District Attorney Daniel Zola shared a personal connection that showed how deeply this case had penetrated the community's consciousness. As a child, he found an original newspaper article about the case in their attic. His mother used the Chiverella story as a lesson to keep him safe, the way parents in Hazelton had done for generations. Once you saw her face, he said of Marice, you couldn't forget it. Then he spoke about Forte with the kind of moral clarity the situation demanded. He was a real monster. Then Carmen Marie Ratke, Marice's sister, stood up to speak for the family. And you have to imagine how difficult this was. Addressing a room full of people, cameras rolling, knowing this moment would be broadcast and recorded and remembered, trying to find words for something that shouldn't require words because it shouldn't have happened at all. We have so many precious memories of Marice, Carmen Marie said, her voice steady despite the emotion. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. Consequently, we will continue to ask ourselves what would have been or could have been. She paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside, and continued. Our parents expressed their sentiments a long time ago. They didn't want punishment or revenge. They wanted justice. Our family now knows the identity of her murderer. Justice has been served today, thanks to the Pennsylvania State Police. Justice has been served today. She described Marice as a sweet and shy girl who was learning to play the organ and aspired to be a nun, reminding everyone that Marice wasn't just a victim, wasn't just a case number, was a real person with dreams and talents and a future that was stolen from her. Ronald Chiverella spoke next, his words reflecting the complex mix of emotions the family felt. I feel a sense of closure. I don't have closure that it's all behind me. As Carmen said, We're all going to have memories of that horrible day. All of those 58 years, the Pennsylvania State Police routinely made their presence known continuously. He described how troopers provided comfort and hope, never left the family's side, forged an emotional connection that transcended professional duty. We'll continue to ask questions we did in the past. What could have been? What would have been? What nieces and nephews? It'll never be known because of the loss of Marice. Ron rattled off a list of troopers by name, referring to them as the frontline team, thanking them individually for their dedication. Over the past 58 years, the Pennsylvania State Police have continuously worked this case, and a special thanks to the frontline team. Our family thanks you so much. The core message from the Chiverella family was clear and needed to be said explicitly. Their parents never sought revenge or punishment. They only wanted justice. It was never about hatred. It was about affording Marice the rights that were ripped away from her, the right to live, to become a mother, to have children, to fulfill the dreams she had that morning when she walked to school with canned goods and hope. Eric Schubert, the 20-year-old college junior who had worked on the case for 2 years, was emotional as he spoke. The investigation that went into all of this work was probably the hardest genealogy task that I've ever faced in over 10 years, as long as I've been doing genealogy. This was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. And it means so much to me that I was able to be on the team that could provide answers to the Chiverella family. Everything that had to go right did. We just kept chugging forward with these really small DNA samples until we got the big fish, which we did in Mr. Forte. Retired Trooper Don Good, 89 years old, attended the press conference, representing that first generation of investigators who'd worked the case when it was fresh, when the leads were hot, when they still believed they'd solve it quickly. His wife had noted that every year on the anniversary of Marice's death, Don brought up her name. Another year had passed, another year without answers. Good said he thought the case would remain unsolved, but never forgot Chiverella, never stopped thinking about her, never stopped wondering if maybe this year would be the year. Ron Marchetti from the Greater Hazelton Historical Society, representing the community that had lived with this shadow for nearly 6 decades, said simply, "I'm just glad it's solved. That's all I can say. Finally, after all these years." Finally, after all these years. The case had cast a long, dark shadow over Hazelton for nearly 58 years, and that press conference represented not just resolution for the Chiverella family, but for an entire community that had lived with fear and grief of an unsolved child murder for generations. The Marice and Chiverella case became the 4th oldest cold case in U.S. history ever solved using genetic genealogy, and it was the oldest in Pennsylvania. To understand how significant this is, we need to talk about the revolution that's happening in cold case investigation right now, because what happened with Marice's case isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a fundamental transformation in how we solve crimes that once seemed unsolvable. Before I do that, though, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far in the video, you're clearly invested in these stories, in seeing justice served even decades later. So do me a favor, hit that like button if you haven't already. It genuinely helps the channel grow and means we can cover more of these incredible cases. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's talk about how genetic genealogy is changing everything. Because this technology is solving cases that were considered completely cold, completely unsolvable, completely hopeless. On April 24, 2018, something happened that changed law enforcement forever, that drew a line in the sand between the old way of investigating cold cases and the new way. Investigators arrested Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer, for a series of murders, rapes, and burglaries committed in California during the 1970s and 1980s. He was known by multiple names depending on which crimes you were talking about: the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. He had committed at least 13 murders that authorities knew about and over 50 rapes, terrorizing entire communities for years, and he had evaded capture for over 40 years. People had given up hope. The victims were elderly or dead. The evidence was old. The case was considered unsolvable. And then it wasn't. How did they catch him? Forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded crime scene DNA to GED-Match, the same public genealogy database that would later be used in the Chiverella case. They found distant relatives, people who'd never heard of Joseph James DeAngelo. people who had nothing to do with his crimes, but who happened to share some DNA with him. A genealogist built family trees, working forward through generations from those distant relatives. They narrowed it down to Joseph James D'Angelo. They verified with direct DNA evidence collected from items he'd discarded. Case closed. A man who thought he'd gotten away with murder for 4 decades was suddenly in handcuffs. The Golden State Killer case proved that forensic genetic genealogy worked, and it worked spectacularly. It sparked widespread adoption by law enforcement across the country, with agencies from local police departments to the FBI suddenly interested in this new tool. Since 2018, over 600 cold cases have been solved using this technology. Think about that number. 600 families who thought they'd never get answers suddenly got them. 600 cases from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s that were sitting in filing cabinets gathering dust, cases where the evidence existed but traditional methods had hit a wall. Some of the notable cases include the 1981 murder of Laura Kempton in New Hampshire, solved in 2023, 42 years later. The 1984 murder of Pamela Cairns, solved in 2019. The 1987 and 1989 murders of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas in California, solved in 2022. The 1988 murder of Stacy Lynn Kahorsky in Georgia, solved in 2022, and they also identified the victim, giving her back her name after decades of being a Jane Doe. The 1995 murder of Patricia Barnes in Kitsap County, solved in 2021. Multiple sexual assault cases from 2003 to 2004 in Pullman, Washington, solved in 2020, catching a serial predator who'd been living free for nearly 2 decades. The technology has even been used to examine cases as old as 1932, though solving cases that old presents unique challenges with DNA degradation and lack of living relatives. The technology works for all kinds of cases, murders, obviously, but also sexual assaults where the perpetrator's DNA was preserved. Unidentified remains, giving names back to Jane and John Does who've been waiting in morgues or potter's fields for decades. Both victims and suspects can be identified through genetic genealogy. Missing persons cases where there are unidentified remains somewhere that might be a match. Combined victim and perpetrator identification in complex cases where multiple people need to be identified. Let me break down exactly how forensic genetic genealogy works, because it's important to understand the science and the process, especially if we're going to have informed discussions about the ethics and legality of it. Traditional forensic DNA, the kind used in CODIs, the kind you hear about on crime shows, analyzes about 20 specific locations in your genome called loci. These are just markers, specific spots where your DNA varies from other people's DNA. They're enough to identify you if your DNA is already in the database, giving you essentially a unique genetic fingerprint. But CODIs only contains DNA from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scene samples. If you've never been arrested or convicted, if you've never had your DNA forcibly taken by law enforcement, your DNA isn't in there. That's a deliberate policy choice designed to protect privacy. We don't require every citizen to provide DNA to the government. Genetic genealogy is completely different, and understanding that difference is crucial. When you take a commercial ancestry test like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, or one of the other services that have become so popular over the last decade, they analyze hundreds of thousands of markers across your entire genome. Way more information than forensic DNA testing provides. They're not just looking for unique identifiers. They're looking at your actual genetic heritage, the specific DNA sequences that tell you where your ancestors came from, what traits you might have inherited, what genetic relatives you might share. Most people who take these tests upload their results to public genealogy databases like GeneMatch so they can find biological relatives, build family trees, discover if they're related to anyone famous or interesting. It's become a hobby for millions of people, this desire to understand where we came from and who we're connected to. Here's where it gets interesting from a law enforcement perspective. When investigators upload crime scene DNA to these public databases, they're not looking for an exact match. They're not expecting to find the perpetrator's DNA sitting there waiting to be discovered, because what are the odds of that? Instead, they're looking for relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, sixth cousins, people who share a common ancestor with the perpetrator somewhere back in the 1800s or early 1900s. Then a genetic genealogist, Someone like Eric Schubert with expertise in both genetics and genealogical research builds family trees from those distant matches. They work forward through the generations, identifying descendants of that common ancestor, creating diagrams that look like those family trees you made in elementary school, but vastly more complex. They narrow it down to a manageable pool of suspects. Maybe a dozen people, maybe 4 people like in Marice's case, maybe just 1 or 2 in some cases. Police then investigate those suspects using traditional methods, surveillance, interviews, background checks, trying to place them at the crime scene. They verify with direct DNA evidence, usually by collecting discarded items or obtaining a warrant for a direct DNA sample. And it works. It's incredibly effective when done properly. It's a combination of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned detective work, technology and shoe leather, genetics and genealogy all working together. But here's the thing. Forensic genetic genealogy is controversial, and we need to talk about that honestly because the ethical questions are real and important. The big question that people are debating right now, is it an invasion of privacy? Here's the argument against using genetic genealogy in law enforcement. When you upload your DNA to a public genealogy database, you're not consenting to law enforcement use. You're just trying to find out if you're related to anyone interesting, trying to build your family tree, trying to learn about your heritage. You're not expecting police to use your DNA to investigate crimes. But by uploading your DNA, you're potentially implicating your relatives in criminal investigations, relatives who never consented to anything, third cousins you've never met, fourth cousins you don't even know exist. Is that fair? Should your decision to do a genealogy hobby potentially lead police to investigate your distant relatives? And there's a broader concern about genetic privacy. Once your DNA is in a public database, who knows what else it might be used for in the future? What if insurance companies get access? What if employers start discriminating based on genetic information? Where does it stop? Here's the argument in favor of using genetic genealogy. These are public databases. People voluntarily upload their DNA knowing that it's a public resource. They're choosing to make that information available, and public means public. Anyone can access it, including law enforcement. And we're using this technology to solve violent crimes, murders, rapes, cases where victims and families deserve answers. If your distant cousin committed a heinous crime, if they murdered someone or sexually assaulted someone or destroyed a family, shouldn't law enforcement be able to use every tool available to catch them? The victims' rights matter too. The family's need for closure matters too. Justice matters too. Most experts, including ethicists, geneticists, and legal scholars who've studied this issue, recommend limiting the use of forensic genetic genealogy to serious violent crimes, murder, sexual assault, cases where the harm is severe and the public interest in solving the case is high. They don't want police using genetic genealogy for property crimes or minor offenses. Some call for judicial oversight, requiring warrants before uploading DNA to genealogy databases, providing a check on law enforcement power. Guidelines are still being developed by various organizations. Legal frameworks are still evolving as courts grapple with novel questions about genetic privacy. Different states are taking different approaches to regulation. But here's what's not controversial. What everyone agrees on regardless of where they stand on the privacy debate: families deserve answers. Victims deserve justice. And DNA doesn't forget, even when everyone else does. The Marice Ann Chiverella case is a perfect example of why this technology matters, why we have to find ways to use it responsibly, but use it nonetheless. Without genetic genealogy, James Paul Forte's name would never have come up. He wasn't in any investigation files. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't even a person of interest. Traditional investigative methods, no matter how thorough, no matter how dedicated, would never have identified him because he existed outside the scope of the investigation. Without genetic genealogy, the Chiverella family would have gone to their graves just like their parents, never knowing who killed their sister, never getting answers, never getting closure, never getting justice. Without genetic genealogy, a 9-year-old girl who just wanted to bring canned goods to her teacher would have remained a nameless tragedy in a forgotten file cabinet, a case that everyone acknowledged was important, but nobody could solve. After the February 2022 press conference, Lieutenant Devin Bertosky made a statement that should concern everyone, a statement that suggests James Paul Forte's crimes might have been even more extensive than anyone knows. Current troopers believe Forte, could have committed even more crimes. Corporal Mark Barron echoed this concern. Police said it may not have been the only crime Forte committed and asked anyone with information to come forward. Think about the timeline we know. 1964, James Paul Forte murders 9-year-old Marice Ann Chiverella. 1974, he violently sexually assaults a 23-year-old woman and receives essentially no punishment, just probation and a bill. 1978, he's arrested for reckless endangerment and harassment involving a gun, though we don't know what happened with that case. 1980, he dies. That's 16 years between the murder and his death. What happened in those 16 years? What happened in the 10 years between murdering Marice and assaulting that woman in 1974? What happened between 1974 and 1978? What happened between 1978 and 1980? Were there other victims who never came forward? Were there other crimes that went unreported or unsolved? After the announcement identifying Forte, a woman named Gina Donahue Connors came forward with a chilling story that suggests how close she came to becoming another victim. She was approximately 9 or 10 years old in the years following Chiverella's murder, sometime in the mid to late 1960s. She was walking with a friend at the corner of 3rd and Alter Streets in Hazelton, ironically, right near where the Chiverella family lived, when a man in a car stopped. He tried to get them into his car, using that classic predator approach. "Come on, we'll give you a ride. I will give you a ride." The girls refused, their instincts or their parents' warnings keeping them safe. But he persisted. "No, no, no. Come on, we'll give you a ride." They ran into an A&P store for safety, using the presence of other adults to protect themselves, and the man drove away. After seeing James Paul Forte identified in 2022, after seeing his photograph in the Parabon composites, Donahue Connors believed it was the same man. Now that she's made the connection, it brings her closure, but still makes her uneasy, she said. How many other women have similar stories? How many other near misses were there? Investigators stated clearly, while they cannot be certain, state troopers do not believe that Marice Chiverella was Forte's only victim. They believe there are other victims out there, other families still waiting for answers, other cases that might be connected to James Paul Forte. If you or someone you know has information about James Paul Forte or suspected crimes in the Hazelton area from 1964 to 1980, Pennsylvania State Police are asking you to call 570-459-3890. Even decades later, information matters. Even decades later, other families might be waiting for the answers that the Chiverella family finally received. Even decades later, the truth matters and justice matters and closure matters. The Marice Ann Chiverella case proves something powerful, something that every family waiting for answers needs to hear. Justice can come even when it seems impossible, even when it takes 58 years, even when it requires 3 generations of investigators, even when it needs 230-plus Pennsylvania State Police members all contributing something to the eventual solution, even when it takes a teenage genealogist working from his college dorm room, building family trees late into the night when he should be studying for finals, even when it depends on science that didn't exist when the crime was committed, technology that was pure science fiction in 1964. All of it came together to identify a killer who died believing he got away with murder, who lived 38 years thinking his secret was safe, who never faced justice in his lifetime, but who couldn't escape it forever. Corporal Mark Barron's words at that press conference should give hope to every family still waiting for answers. Every person who thinks their case is too old, too cold, too forgotten. Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think this should instill in the families of victims across the state and across the country a sense of hope. And that hope is that no matter how long it may take, we as law enforcement will never give up in trying to find the perpetrators of these heinous crimes that go on. The 1964 investigators couldn't have known that DNA technology would eventually exist. They couldn't have imagined a world where scientists could extract genetic profiles from biological evidence and use that information to identify specific individuals. They couldn't have predicted genetic genealogy, couldn't have envisioned a future where commercial ancestry tests would become popular enough that public databases would contain millions of genetic profiles. But they preserved the evidence anyway. They documented everything with meticulous care. They kept Marice's clothing in proper storage conditions. They filed every report. They interviewed every potential witness. They followed every lead. They did everything right, everything we could ask of investigators with the tools and knowledge available in 1964. And that's why this case was solvable 58 years later. Because they made the right choices even when they couldn't see how those choices would pay off. There are lessons here for every law enforcement agency in the world, principles that should guide how we handle unsolved cases. Preserve evidence. Don't throw anything away just because you can't use it now. Store it properly, document it thoroughly, treat it like it might someday be the key to solving the case, because it might be. Document thoroughly. Write everything down. Take photographs. Record interviews. Create a paper trail that future investigators can follow even decades later. Never assume a case is truly unsolvable. Science keeps advancing. Technology keeps improving. What seems impossible today might be routine in 20 years, might be elementary in 40 years. Stay in contact with families. Don't let them think you've forgotten. Don't let them feel abandoned. A monthly phone call, an annual update, even just a card on the anniversary, it matters more than you know. Review cases regularly. Fresh eyes might see something the original investigators missed. New investigators might have different perspectives or insights. The Pennsylvania State Police maintained monthly contact with the Chiverella family for 58 years. Think about that commitment, about what it means to call a family every single month for nearly 6 decades to say, "We haven't forgotten. We're still working on this. We're still here for you." They reviewed the case annually, pulling out those files every year, going through them again, looking for something new, hoping for a breakthrough. They never gave up. Even when leads dried up, even when suspects died, even when the original investigators retired and passed the case to the next generation, they never gave up. Ronald Chiverella said it perfectly at the press conference. All of those 58 years, the Pennsylvania State Police routinely made their presence known continuously. They provided comfort and hope and never left the family's side. That's what real justice looks like. Not flashy, not fast, not the stuff of television dramas. Just persistent, methodical, dedicated work over decades. Just showing up. Just caring enough to keep trying when everyone else has moved on. But let's not forget the human cost of this case, because that matters just as much as the eventual solution. Carmen and Mary Chiverella died without ever knowing who killed their daughter. They spent 50 years praying for answers they would never receive in their lifetimes. Mary said that prayer at every Sunday dinner, every holiday meal, every family gathering. "Please help the Pennsylvania State Police find the man that hurt my daughter." For 50 years. And she died without hearing those words answered. That's the tragedy that can't be undone, the injustice that persists even after the case is solved. The 4 surviving siblings, Ron, Carmen Marie, Barry, and David, carried the weight of their sister's unsolved murder for their entire adult lives. Think about what that means. They were teenagers or younger when Marice was killed. They grew up, got married, had children, built careers, retired, became grandparents, and through all of it, through every milestone and every achievement and every moment of happiness, there was this shadow, this absence, this unanswered question hanging over everything. Carmen Marie said it in a way that captures the permanent loss. We'll continue to ask ourselves what would have been or could have been. Marice and Chiverella never got to grow up. She never got to graduate from elementary school, never went to high school, never went to prom, never fell in love, never got married, never had children of her own. She never got to become the nun she dreamed of being, never got to dedicate her life to service and faith the way she wanted. She never got to discover what she was truly passionate about, what talents she had, what contributions she could have made to the world. All of that was stolen from her on a cold March morning in 1964 by a man who lived 6 blocks away. Justice came, yes. The truth emerged, yes. But it came too late for so many people. Too late for Carmen and Mary. Too late for Marice herself, who never knew that people would fight for her for 6 decades, who never knew that she would matter so much to so many people. Hazelton, Pennsylvania, changed forever on March 18, 1964. The innocence was lost in a single morning. The trust was broken in a way that never fully healed. The doors got locked and stayed locked. Parents stopped letting children walk alone. The assumption of safety that had defined small-town American life evaporated. But the community never forgot Marice and Chiverella. Her story was passed down through generations. Parents used it to teach their children about safety, about the reality that bad things can happen anywhere to anyone. The case became part of the collective memory of an entire town, a defining moment that everyone who lived through it remembered exactly where they were when they heard. And when the announcement came in 2022 that her killer had been identified, it wasn't just closure for the Chiverella family. It was closure for everyone who had lived with that long, dark shadow for nearly 60 years. Ron Marchetti said it simply, "I'm just glad it's solved. That's all I can say. Finally, after all these years. Finally, after all these years. Finally." Here's what James Paul Forte didn't understand when he murdered Marice and Chiverella in 1964, what he couldn't have understood because the science didn't exist yet. DNA is forever. You can't destroy it by time passing. You can't erase it by dying. You can't take it to the grave, or rather, you can, but investigators will bring you back out of the ground if they need to. Science will catch up. Technology will advance. Genealogists will build family trees connecting distant relatives across generations. And eventually, maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, maybe not even in your lifetime, but eventually, your name will surface. Your crime will be solved. Your victim will get justice. Lieutenant Bertosky said it best, and his words should echo as a warning to every person who's ever committed a violent crime and gotten away with it. Forte may have thought he took his secret to the grave, but we brought him out of the ground and took his DNA. You haven't gotten away with anything. You're just waiting. Let me tell you who the heroes of this story are, because they deserve to be remembered and honored. The original 1964 investigators who preserved evidence they couldn't even use yet, who worked 20-hour days for months without a break, who cared enough to do everything right. Retired Trooper Donald Good, who thought about Marice every single year on the anniversary of her death, who never forgot even when decades passed. Corporal Thomas McAndrew, who told the next generation of investigators that this case was solvable, who refused to let it be forgotten. Corporal Mark Barron, who refused to give up, who read every page of 5,000 pages of reports, who broke down in tears at the press conference because he cared so much. Lieutenant Devin Bertosky, who took a chance on an 18-year-old kid's email, who recognized that thinking outside the box sometimes means trusting someone unconventional. Eric Schubert, who spent 2 years and hundreds of hours building family trees for a little girl he never met, who charged nothing for his work, who did it because it was right. The Chiverella family, who waited 58 years and never lost faith that the truth would emerge, who maintained their dignity and grace even in the face of unspeakable tragedy. And Marice Ann Chiverella herself. She's the hero of this story. The 9-year-old girl who wanted to bring canned goods to her teacher, who wanted to make it to church on time, who dreamed of becoming a nun. She's the hero because her case proved that no matter how long it takes, no matter how cold the trail gets, no matter how impossible it seems, justice is always possible. Her case proved that DNA never forgets. Her case proved that dedicated investigators will keep working for decades if that's what it takes. Her case proved that science will eventually catch up, that truth will eventually emerge, that secrets can't stay buried forever. The Marice Ann Chiverella case is the 4th oldest cold case in American history, solved using forensic genetic genealogy, but it won't be the last. Right now, as you're watching this video, genetic genealogists are building family trees for other cold cases. DNA labs are testing evidence that's been sitting in storage for decades, evidence that original investigators preserved not knowing if it would ever be useful. Investigators are uploading profiles to genealogy databases, hoping for that distant relative match that will start the process. Families are waiting for the phone call that changes everything, the call that says, "We found him," or "We found her," or "We finally have answers." And somewhere, a killer who thinks they got away with murder is about to learn they were wrong. Because justice never expires. Truth never becomes irrelevant. The passage of time doesn't make murder acceptable or forgivable or forgettable. Science keeps advancing. Technology keeps improving. And your DNA is forever. If you found this story as compelling as I did, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm show this video to more people who care about justice, who believe that cold cases matter, who think families deserve answers no matter how long they have to wait. Second, subscribe to Cold Case Desk and turn on notifications. We cover the cases that took decades to solve, the ones where persistence and science finally caught up to evil, the ones that prove justice is possible even when it seems impossible. Third, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about forensic genetic genealogy. Tell me if you think 58 years is too long to wait for justice, or if you think any amount of time is worth it if the truth finally emerges. I read every single comment, and I want to hear from you. The Marice Ann Chiverella case teaches us something profound. The little girl who never made it to church on that cold March morning in 1964, who never got to deliver her canned goods to Sister Josephine, who never got to fulfill her dream of becoming a nun, she did eventually get her miracle. It just took 58 years. It took the work of 230 investigators across 3 generations. It took the brilliance of a teenage genealogist who cared about a stranger. It took the relentless march of science and the refusal of dedicated people to give up. But she got it. Justice came. Truth prevailed. And James Paul Forte's secret was dragged from the grave and exposed to the light. For Marice Ann Chiverella, who wanted to be a nun. For Carmen and Mary Chiverella, who prayed for answers they never received in life, but whose prayers were eventually answered. For Ron, Carmen Marie, Barry, and David, who carried their sister's memory for 58 years and finally got to know the truth. For the town of Hazelton, which lost its innocence on March 18, 1964, but never lost hope that justice would come. For every family still waiting for answers, still hoping that this year might be the year, still believing that someone somewhere cares enough to keep trying. This is their story, and this is why we never give up. Subscribe to Cold Case Desk for more stories like this. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for caring about justice. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop believing that the truth will eventually come out, no matter how long it takes. DNA never forgets, even when everyone else does.